Good morning and welcome to Beyond the Headlines. We're your hosts, Anna Miller, Fatima Ibrahim, and Genevieve Tallmeister. This week, we'll be unpacking the question, is post-secondary education accessible in Canada? Beyond the Headlines is a weekly current affairs show that aims to make public policy discussions more accessible to you. We take you beyond the headlines of our daily news, bringing you access to current leaders through in-depth interviews. You can join us in the conversation by tweeting at beyond_headlines. That's BYOND_headlines. As university and college tuition rates in Canada are creeping up every year, questions of affordability are becoming more pertinent. Changes to OSAP and student funding are hitting students harder than ever before, yet having an undergraduate degree, and sometimes even a master's degree, remains the prerequisite for most well-paying jobs. On this week's episode of Beyond the Headlines, we'll be unpacking the question on everyone's mind. Is post-secondary education accessible in Canada? We'll be investigating the sociocultural and economic barriers which prevent students from attending university and college and which prevent parents from saving for their children's education in the first place. We'll also be looking at the policies and programs which can make higher education more accessible in the long run. Joining us on the conversation to provide their insights and perspectives are guests Luke Connell, André, Côté, and Andrew Parkin.
Luke Connell is a leader in the field of social innovation. He currently serves as the executive director of the nonprofit initiative SmartSaver, based out of the Omega Foundation here in Toronto. SmartSaver helps modest and low-income families save for their children's post-secondary education. As the director of SmartSaver, Luke has trained and worked closely alongside hundreds of frontline staff, working to improve access to government savings programs. He is passionate about equity and helping low and modest income families begin their education savings early on. Luke has facilitated SmartSaver's wide network of over 70 partners across Canada, helping the organization reach more than 30,000 eligible children to date, and doubling the amount of families who have opened education savings accounts. So thank you for joining us in studio today. To begin, why do you believe that education savings is important to begin with?
So education savings are important because children with savings put aside for education are much more likely to attend post-secondary than children who have no savings. And the common argument that we hear is that providing scholarships or bursaries will have more children attend post-secondary, but really we don't see that as a motivating factor when you look at the research. And all signs point to the earlier that you start saving for a child, the stronger their college-bound identity becomes and the more likely they are to attend post-secondary.
Right. And could you just describe how the Registered Education Savings Plan and Canada Learning Bond, those types of federal programs, how do they work to increase access, and how have you seen this change or increase in the most recent years?
That's a good question. So the RESP, the Registered Education Savings Plan, is a government savings account. That's a tax-sheltered account where a family can save for their child's post-secondary expenses. The benefits of using an RESP versus keeping your money, say, under the mattress are some quite lucrative tax benefits as well as government grants that exist. So all families who participate in the RESP process receive a match on their own savings. So regardless of the household income, a family would receive a 20 to 40 cent match on every dollar they contribute, which is quite attractive. And if you're low income, there's added incentives. So there's the Canada Learning Bond, which is a $2,000 kickstart into the RESP that requires no contribution. And that's where we focused our program, was primarily getting low income savers to start, as the research again points to high income families using RESPs at a much higher rate than low income families.
Right, so would you say that that's kind of what makes the federal savings programs unique?
It's definitely unique when you look at other programs in Canada that incentivize savings and certain behaviors. And then internationally, the Canada Education Savings Program is very robust. It does have a great program. So when we see something like the Canada Learning Bond, which is free money that families are not accessing, at the same rate as a high-income family who can't benefit from that. That's where we saw an issue. But I think Canada on its own is doing a great job of helping families save and be motivated to save through the RESP.
So could you speak to the barriers that families face and just barriers in the uptake of the programs? So whether that's lack of awareness of the programs, lack of accessibility to these services, or even the belief that people might not have enough to begin saving in the first place.
Well, it's maybe a good chance to talk quickly about Smart Saver. So I'm the executive director of the Omega Foundation, and the Smart Saver program is a program of the Omega Foundation, and it's designed to help low-income families learn about and access RESP accounts. And we are rooted in examining the barriers of access. So currently, we offer an online application that makes it very easy for a family to choose between a wide range of RESP providers, access their Canada Learning Bond, and start that journey to post-secondary savings and hopefully attainment. But when we first started our program, we came across the Canada Learning Bond and wondered to ourselves, why aren't people accessing this? So the first question was that why aren't people accessing? And the first thing we did was to go into the community and interview families, interview frontline workers, interview government staff, both informally and formally, and find out why parents weren't accessing this benefit. Because when you add it up, it's a no-brainer. If someone came to you and said, the government's giving you $2,000, no strings attached, to pay for your child's post-secondary attainment, why wouldn't 100% of the people who are eligible for it access that? So when you peel back the onion of like why that's happening, all the things you mentioned are true. It's low awareness being number one. Number two, the government doesn't have a simple way of delivering this. So they've gone to a number of financial institutions, insurance companies, a small number of RESP providers, and said, you offer this product to the public and you promote it, and we're not going to give very clear instructions on how to access that benefit. So I think that's one side of it. Going further, you need a birth ID, which require in order to access a social insurance number. So those are two different government entities you're dealing with, and then you would have to identify one of those 90 RESP providers. So think of yourselves as a newcomer to Canada. English isn't your first language, or you're Indigenous living on a remote reserve somewhere. Visiting a Service Ontario office and then visiting a Service Canada office and finding a bank. It can't happen like it does for a lot of urban dwellers or wealthier people, where they can make those connections a lot faster and have the time and capacity to do that. So it's a long answer to your question. But I think that those things you mentioned are all the barriers that lead to a low take-up. And when we started our program, the Canada Learning Bond take-up, this is in 2009, was at 19%. And now we're just under 40. So I think us, along with a number of community partners, have done a good job of promoting it, creating easier to access opportunities for families to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and just speaking to what Smart Saver does, and from what you've seen, how do you think that the face of education savings is becoming more innovative? So whether that's through like a rebate system or just having like an online portal.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question too. So I think, for us, we've tried to put ourselves in a place to put the most innovative products in front of families. So again, to back up the process, 5 or 10 years ago, if a family wanted an RESP, they would have had to make an appointment at their local branch of their bank if they had chosen their bank. They would then go in, have to provide ID, sit through that data collection period, go through a know your client process where the financial advisor would interview the parent and determine like what type of investment's right for them. I've already lost you, right? Like we're like there's a lot of hurdles to jump through, and I think it was intimidating, and parents found that whole process quite challenging. And what's happening now is a number of RESP providers have seen that was an obstacle to people benefiting from their product. So we have groups like Simple, who now you can go online and open an RESP in 15 minutes and never talk to a person. So I don't care. I don't mind dealing with the bank, but I'd choose that option. Anyone would choose that option, because it's like, why take half of your day off when you can just on your smartphone open an account? And then BMO, National Bank, RBC, Scotiabank are all offering now remote services where you can either open the RESP over the phone or via mail. So I think these are great, and I think a lot of this comes from the fact that Digital security has improved a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. So government set the bar quite high. They required having, a wet signature, meaning someone would have to provide a signature with a pen in person at a branch. They then, a couple of years ago, eliminated that requirement, which lets the providers then innovate and find new ways to deliver that through digital signature, or as I've mentioned with Scotiabank and RBC, they actually will record your conversation and record your voice and use voice verification technology and hold that yes that you say when they say, do you have our permission to open the account on your child's behalf? And you say yes, that yes now counts as a signature. And that can be used to open an account. So that's pretty cool that can happen now.
That is really cool. And this kind of leads into my next question about accessibility, specifically for those living in more remote areas of Canada and for Indigenous groups. So what is Smart Saver doing to increase access for these groups? And what do you believe to be, like, I guess, the barriers that you've seen amongst these populations?
Sure. So probably the barriers is the first place to start. I think I mentioned that earlier, like the back and forth to government entities. You know, I talked to a woman who runs an organization in Winnipeg, and she's from a band in northern Manitoba, and we were discussing the distance barriers to services. And she said she's a 2-hour drive up the highway, then you turn off the highway and you lose cell phone reception, and you drive 4 hours down a gravel road and you end up at her band. Wow. And she was like, no one on my band has an RESP. Most of them don't have birth ID. And I think, you know, take the issues suffered by someone living in a city and low income in terms of bandwidth to deal with something like an additional appointment and accessing ID, and multiply it by 100, because now you're coupling cost to go access these IDs. You know, a lot, and we back this up even further with Indigenous issues. A lot of children who are Indigenous have gone through the foster system. Way higher percentage than the general public. Multiples, not percentages higher, like 10 times more in terms of like per capita basis. When those kids go through the system, they often only get photocopies of their documents. And the trustee, who's a law firm somewhere, keeps their original documents under lock and key in a filing cabinet. You can't get a birth ID or a social insurance number or open a bank account with a photocopy. So now, again, another layer of burden, another barrier. And we can go further. I think, you know, when we talk around this systems failures, I think post-secondary institutions have also failed Indigenous children in the sense that they have scholarships that are available, that are not being accessed. They're not doing a good job of helping to highlight those opportunities to those children earlier. So bringing them out of the reserve environments, bringing them on campus, showing them that they can be nurses, they can be doctors, they can be engineers. So like we're leaving it too late. And so that's one piece. And I think where we've failed Indigenous communities is helping them understand what the RESP can be used for. And what I mean by that, when we talk to parents, not often, but we'll hear from families, well, my child may not go to university, so there's no real point in opening an RESP. We very rarely hear that, but I think even for parents who do think that on reserve, there are other costs that are associated with post-secondary that are the barriers, so whether it's transportation off reserve, housing, you name it, there's bigger costs because they're not living next door to U of T, or they're not living next door to York, and they can't live at home and take the bus to school. The RESP can pay for any cost associated with post-secondary. So again, where I think we've let individuals down is understanding the breadth of what RESP dollars can be used for.
As the executive director for a nonprofit organization, which partners do you work most closely alongside? So whether that's the municipal level of government, provincial, federal, and how are you leveraging these different partnerships in order to increase Smart Saver's reach?
Okay, so I think, you know, we try to be quite innovative too, and when I say innovative, it usually means opportunistic. Mm-hmm. So I think we're a willing partner who will work with any partner who has the opportunity to share this with a large number of families. And the larger, the better. So I think, you know, we work with federal government. Their ability to reach families exists, but they're, you know, a couple steps away. So we do work with them. We have partnerships with a few provincial governments. And when I say with provincial governments, we typically work within social development. So the branch of government that would be delivering welfare or income support. And then municipally, we also deal with governments, but they aren't typically the best suited, except for Ontario, and I'll explain why. So in Canada, social services are delivered by the provinces. In Ontario, it's delivered by municipalities. So, for instance, Toronto Employment Social Services, which delivers income support and welfare in Toronto, is a partner of ours. They deliver more income support and more welfare for the City of Toronto than all of our partners in the Maritimes combined for all of the provinces.
Okay.
So I think, again, like we try to identify those partners that have a big opportunity. And we like to use the word upstream, so reaching families as close to government services and products as possible. So, we have worked in the past with grassroots organizations that work locally. So in Toronto, good examples would be like Wood Green or like St. Chris or like East Scarborough Storefront. They do a good job, and they do a good job for a year or two, but they serve the same families for a number of years. So you reach a point where you reach the maximum capacity of families they have available to promote this to, and then you have to move on to that new opportunity. And hopefully each opportunity sort of grows and leads to a bigger partner as you can demonstrate our ability to help them help their families access our ESPs and the Canada Learning Bond.
Mm-hmm. And thinking more broadly, I guess, what sort of policy changes do you think would be necessary in order to increase the amount of people who go to university or college? What kind of changes to government programs or, partnerships or anything?
It's interesting you asked that. And, I think the easiest answer that everyone talks about would be to either make the Canada Learning Bond automatic, and that's for our program. But the easiest answer that if you ask someone in public, what could we do to make post-secondary attainment happen? Most people would probably say make it free. Mm-hmm. So, eliminate the cost of tuition, right? But I think we need to look a little deeper into that. And when I say that, we have some good examples in Canada. So Quebec's a great example. Quebec has the lowest tuition rates for post-secondary education of any province in Canada. It's by far the lowest. It's I think it's $2,500 a year, which there's many ways to scratch together $2,500 a year. And don't judge me for saying that. But Quebec has the lowest participation rate amongst low-income students of any province in Canada. So, I think that, to me, the message there, devaluing education can devalue it in other ways as well, not just by the sticker price. It can devalue it psychologically for a kid and saying, well, if it's free, what's the value of it? And they may not see the long-term value of going. Whereas what we look at is kids as little as 3 or 4 with $500 in a savings account. They're doing better in math and science than kids without savings accounts, and there's research that shows that. So I think for us, an interesting, policy change would be to start to create early bursaries and early scholarships that are being awarded much earlier, under 10, as opposed to being awarded to high achieving or diverse students at endgame, because those kids will go. The kids that are going to go and apply for the scholarships, they're on their way to school. The kids that we're worried about and making an impact on, the kids who, when they're 7 or 8, it's a household that may not have a post-secondary degree in it. There's not a lot of momentum pushing them there. This account could be that one thing that motivates them to go. So I think that would be one thing. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is the Canada Learning Bond. It was launched in 2004. So the first kids who are eligible to receive that grant are going to be going on to post-secondary next year, 2020 or 2020. 2021 they'll be enrolling. A lot of kids' parents still haven't gotten their Canada Learning Bond for them, and I don't think the kids whose parents haven't accessed them that money by the time they've enrolled should be missing out on it. So I think something would be interesting if they could figure out a way to essentially decouple the Canada Learning Bond from the RESP and have it maybe go into a tuition account for a child. And so when a child applies for student aid, let's say, wouldn't it be helpful if we could eliminate $2,000 of debt for them by tapping into their Canada Learning Bond at that point of need? So that will be something policy-wise that could be unpacked over the next year or so.
Definitely. And so in your opinion, do you think that post-secondary education, as it is right now, is accessible in Canada?
I'll bring up, that's a good question. And I paused because I'll bring it back to what I said earlier. In Canada, it's not great. But when you look at it compared to other places, we're doing pretty good. And I think, you know, we see that with the diversity in our classes and the fact that you know, it's relatively affordable outside of a few of the major schools where the degrees are getting more expensive. So I think, you know, largely, like, we're doing a good job. You know, to put it into perspective, and we look at income levels, the Canada Learning Bond is for families who are under $47,000. We also know what the behavior of families with RESPs are who are making more than $95,000. So we can see whether rich and poor families are using RESPs or not. And despite the fact that they have much more lucrative grants to benefit the RESPs, Canada Learning Bond eligible families, so low-income families, are only using RESPs at a rate of around 40%. Versus high-income families, which are 75%. And what's interesting is that statistic mirrors participation rates in post-secondary. So maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm like too optimistic in the role of savings, but my thinking is if we can get that number closer to the same and have all kids participating from savings at the same rate, I would imagine we would close that gap a little bit, which is, like, I guess what we're after, right? Not every kid's going to go onto a 4-year degree or onto post-secondary, but if we can at least have, like, rich and poor, middle class sort of all participating at the same rate, like, that would show us that it's attainable.
Great. That's all the questions I have for you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll continue the conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Once again, that was Luke Connell. We'll continue our discussion with Andrew Parkin after a short musical break. This is All Types of Ways by Dave Sampson.
Am I just treading water? Am I in too deep? I know that there ain't no guarantee. You got me running around like crazy. You got me on my knees. This situation might be the death of me. 'Cause girl got me feeling all types of ways. You must think I'm crazy, but you don't never say. Yesterday you loved me, tomorrow's another day. And girl got me feeling all types of ways. Every day's a little harder, doing the same damn thing. Calling you up, you don't ever call me. Well, should I be a little bolder? I'm sick of this chase. Am I in or am I just in the way? Girl got me feeling all types of ways. You must think I'm crazy, but you don't never say. Yesterday you loved me, tomorrow's another day. And girl got me feeling all types of ways. All types of ways. All types of ways. Am I just treading water? Am I in too deep? I know that there ain't no guarantee. Girl got me feeling all types of ways. You must think I'm crazy, but you don't never say. Yesterday you loved me, tomorrow's another day. And girl got me feeling all types of ways. I'm just holding on. I'm just holding on. Yeah. I'm just holding on.
That was All Types of Ways by Dave Sampson. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. This week, we're discussing the accessibility of post-secondary education in Canada. Remember, you can join us in the conversation by tweeting at @beyond_headlines.
Andrew Parkin is the Executive Director of the Environics Institute for Survey Research, a not-for-profit agency created in 2006 to promote relevant and original public opinion and social research on important issues of public policy and social change. Prior to joining the Institute, Andrew served as the Director of the Mowat Center and Associate Professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Director General of the Council of Ministers of Education in Canada, Associate Executive Director and Director of Research and Program Development at the Canada Millennium Scholarship Foundation, and Co-Director of the Centre for Research and Information on Canada. He has also worked as an independent public policy analyst and consultant, providing strategic advice, issue analysis, and policy research to a variety of national and international clients in the areas of education and skills development, social and economic policy, and public opinion research. Andrew has convened, informed, and led national and international discussions on a wide range of public policy issues and acted as an authoritative public spokesperson on education, federalism, and the Canadian political community in both official languages. A political sociologist by background, he completed his postdoctorate at Dalhousie University, his PhD at the University of Bradford, and his BA at Queen's University. He has received several academic honors, including a Commonwealth Scholarship and a Killam Postdoctoral Fellowship, and has authored or co-authored numerous publications on Canadian public policy.
Alrighty, so I am in Andrew's office with him, kindly having me. First question we have is, what role does the government currently have in post-secondary education accessibility in Ontario? And then, I guess kind of further, is it very direct, kind of more hands-off, like subsidies, tuition caps, free tuition? And what role should the government be taking on?
Yeah, that's two questions there. What is it doing and what should it be doing? I think the first thing I want to say is, the government has a huge role to play in promoting access to post-secondary education. But I would say it starts in the place where people don't normally look. In other words, the ministry that I think is most responsible is the Education Ministry, which does K-12. And usually when we think about access to post-secondary education, we're thinking about the things you mentioned: tuition policy, funding for universities and colleges, and so on, all of which are done from the Ministry of Advanced Education. But if students don't want to be students, if they don't want to be in school, if they want to get the heck out of school, if they don't have information about the importance of further education after high school, they won't go. And all those things happen long before anyone interacts with anything that we call post-secondary education, before they apply to the applicant center, before they think about OSAP, before they choose a university and college. So, the key parts of access are issues around encouragement, success, motivation, information, preparation, and that's all done in school. So the government has a big role, but part of its role is indirect, because part of its role is to create a successful K-12 education system and then get the heck out of the way. So teachers play a huge role. Any kind of services, structure, support around students as they're in their teenage years and looking to the future, I think is sort of, I guess I would call it ground zero for access. So that's kind of the first point. At the same time, you can then go on from there and say, well, sure, if you get that part right, then you still need an appropriate set of policies for post-secondary education. You need a well-funded sector. You need a student financial aid system that works. You need a respectable tuition policy, and so on. So all those things you mentioned, yeah, they have a direct role.
Are financial constraints a large reason for post-secondary education enrollment gaps?
So, unhelpfully, I'm going to say the answer is yes and no, and I'll get back to one of the things I was saying at the outset. The way I would phrase it is poverty is a constraint and responsible for PSE enrollment gaps. But poverty has a number of effects, and they're not all in the form of cash in hand. Information is also a big issue, and historically, in the sense that historically there have been student financial aid programs that are available, but they weren't quite invisible, but they certainly weren't very predictable.
Have there been any policy initiatives or programs in Canada that have successfully and notably increased post-secondary education enrollment?
Yes. So let me focus a little bit. There was an interesting report that just came out a little while ago from HECO and SRDC, and they looked at the gap in enrollment between higher and lower income students across all the provinces, and they also looked at policy changes around access and tried to figure out if there was any relationship. A couple things they noticed. First of all, not many jurisdictions have succeeded in boosting enrollment for low-income students, but Ontario is one of those that has. And the second thing is that the change in Ontario was timed to the focus through OSAP of increasing the value and the transparency of grants to low-income students. So in other words, the sort of free tuition for low-income students policy does seem to have had an impact, or at least starting to have an impact. And there's some other research behind that that's different but related, because it's the same idea, because SRDC ran an experiment in New Brunswick where they offered high school students money to pay for their post-secondary education, but they offered it to them in grade 9. So they essentially promised it to them. Right? They didn't give them the money in grade 9, but they said, if you finish grade 10, I think I'll get the money right. I think if you finish grade 10, we'll put $2,000 aside for your post-secondary education. You finish grade 11, we'll put another $2,000. And you finish grade 12, we'll put another $4,000. So you'll have $8,000 in a kind of virtual account. And when you go to post-secondary education, you can access those dollars. So the idea here is in some ways it's actually no different from student financial aid, because if they graduated grade 12 and applied to the government for student aid, they probably would have got it. The only difference is that they were telling them about it in grade 9, right? They're saying, here's this, it's set aside for you, it's in your name, it's like a bank account. And it was a randomized control trial, so they made this promise to a certain number of students, and then there were a certain number of comparable students who did not get that promise. And over time it made a difference. The students who had that promise of money eventually were more likely to go on to post-secondary education, and really interesting, they were more likely to finish. And so the answer to your question is yes, so money does make a difference. But I get back to the point that you can't just sort of put money into some kind of complicated bureaucratic system, and so that only 10 people in the province really know it's there. It's money that's a meaningful amount of money that is visible, that can really counteract the financial costs of going. The other thing I was going to say, though, that's totally different point and may not be the one that you're going towards. But again, we've talked a lot about university. I think we need to remember that the college sector in Ontario, and some other provinces too, like Quebec, but we'll stick to Ontario, was created precisely for the objective of widening access. It was created to give a more varied range of after high school learning, training, education opportunities to a much wider group of young people in the province. And as a project, it's been hugely successful. People like me and nuts people will go around saying Canada is the most educated country in the world, right? We have the highest education attainment. And that's very true. And it's true for one reason only, and it's because of the college sector. If we did not have that sector, we would not be leading anybody in anything related to post-secondary education. And it creates a system, I think, in Ontario that has much less of a cliff or a wall. In a number of other countries, you have a university system or nothing. So if you're not a university-bound person, you have very few options. And those are societies that tend to have greater income inequality, lower overall access. So Ontario has a post-secondary system that has, again, many different doors, pathways, however you want to describe it. I think in this conversation it's important to to remember that, because again, it has been hugely successful. It is why many more people in Ontario have a post-secondary education than almost any jurisdiction in the world.
In your opinion, is post-secondary education financially accessible to those residing in Ontario?
So this is a question where you have to, I think, concede the point that the answer is different depending on whether you're talking about it at a very general system-wide level or you're talking about individuals and individual cases. So are there individuals in Ontario who are not able to afford post-secondary education? Obviously, absolutely. You could stand on any street corner and wouldn't take long before you found someone in those situations. And I say that because the other part of the answer is that overall as a system, Ontario has one of the most accessible post-secondary systems that there are. It's hard to point to one that's more accessible. But it's always important to keep those two things in mind, because to say a system on the whole is accessible is not to deny the experience of those who end up on the other side of that. The other point I would make about this, though, is kind of just doing the full loop back to where we began the conversation. I think where we can go wrong on access in Ontario is if we continue just to reduce it to a very narrow financial calculus, because that's where you end up with something like a 10% tuition cut that actually benefits wealthy students more than less wealthy students. If you insist that sort of the issue is just the price you have to pay, and you overlook the issue around how much aid is provided, how it's communicated, when it's communicated, and all those other issues we talked about whether a person even finds being in a classroom to be a rewarding experience. If you find that campuses have nothing to offer that's relevant to you, your community, your needs, your trajectory, and that there's no one in the faculty who can speak to any of that, I'm not sure if it's money that's going to be the issue that turns you away.
Right.
And so I want to keep both these things in view at the same time. Obviously, for some students, it's a financial issue and a financial crisis.
Yeah.
But if you stand back and look at it at the system level, you get overall Ontario has done not too badly, A, and B, there are so many other issues around it that if we keep thinking that this is just a fight about tuition, we'll end up not serving well those students who are really facing the biggest access challenges.
That'll have to be a whole other episode.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, that was Andrew Parkin. We're continuing our conversation about Canadian post-secondary education and accessibility. Remember, you can join us in the conversation by tweeting at @beyond_headlines. That's BYOND_headlines. Our last guest is André Côté. André Côté is actually an alum of the Master of Public Policy program here at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, who, fun fact, co-founded one of our famous student-led initiatives, the Public Good Initiative. He's a former public servant of the OPS, working at the Ministry of Finance with the Deputy Premier and the Ministry of the Treasury Board, as well as the Ministry for Advanced Education and Skills Development as a policy advisor. André's also worked at TCU and Digital Services and is now principal consultant at Côté & Company Strategies, a mission-driven public policy consultancy focusing on higher education and future of work, digital technology, public finance, as well as many other areas. So welcome, André. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about this whole conversation about the lack of affordability or lack of accessibility in post-secondary education. I'd first want to jump in to talk about your work. You have a really interesting platform in the OSAP transformation digital case study. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure, absolutely. First off, a pleasure to be here to participate. And as an alum of the, I guess now the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, it's great to be back. So the digital case study was a concept that took shape after I had spent 3 years in government working on the OSAP reforms, the student financial aid reforms, and a bunch of other things in the higher education space as a ministerial advisor. And so the core idea was the case study is a tried and true teaching and learning method used in public policy schools and business schools and all sorts of places. Why was the case study stuck in the analog age, the 20-page written version? why has it not entered current Netflix-driven era? And so the idea was, could we take a compelling case that I and some others I worked on with this had really sort of lived through and seen from various angles, and build it out more through digital media? And so the form it took was really like a 40-minute documentary, quite high production value, chunked out into various episodes that tells a whole bunch of aspects of the story, from student advocacy that helped to support the research that guided the reform, to a lot of the machinery of government stuff that happened to advance the free tuition student aid transformations with the government, to the phase when the election happened, the Liberal government left, a new government came in, and they received this big transformation and decided they had to make some changes based on what they saw. So I won't spoil the punchline, but
Yeah.
And so we're really excited. We developed this last year, and we're testing it with a range of public policy programs across the province, and
Sweet, yeah.
proudly with the Monk School,
Yep.
but also with a bunch of other universities and colleges, and with professional learners through IPAC and
Nice,
in a few
okay.
other places. And our hope is that this new model of digital case study is something that people find compelling, and hopefully we can develop some other ones, maybe on climate change, maybe on...
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sweet, thank you. So now, taking a step back, in your opinion, and as a graduate of a post-secondary institution, what is affordable post-secondary education, and do you feel that pursuing a post-secondary education is affordable today?
So, in my view, an affordable post-secondary education is one where finances are not a barrier to access. Finances are not a barrier to participation or to opportunity. And so in that sense, I think affordability is a bit of a relative concept based upon what people are capable of paying, or the resources at their disposal. And so just to sort of put it on the table, and we'll come to it when we talk about the Ontario's free tuition transformation, what's happened since. The idea of universal free tuition is not something that I necessarily believe in. I think there's a value to post-secondary education. I think the value is enhanced by having to pay for it. But I also think that to make it accessible, there need to be supports, subsidies, needs or income based to those who can't gain access. Finances should not be a barrier to anybody, but for those for whom finances are not a barrier, they should be paying because they're getting substantial value.
Right, yeah. And so today, would you say, in terms of that definition, that post-secondary education is affordable?
In my view, it's reasonably affordable in Ontario. And I think you can look at it in a few ways. So sure, our tuitions and fees are high relative to other provinces. I think when you look at the Canadian numbers vis-a-vis other international peers, Canada is on the sort of upper middle, I would say. So the US and the UK are quite high. Some European countries are free or low, and we're sort of in the upper middle. And so if Ontario is a little bit high for Canada, Ontario would be a bit above that as well. And I think the key thing to look at is the idea of net tuition or net cost. And so that starts to bake in all of the student aid and supports that can be accessed to bring down, to offset the tuition and fees that paid. And so what's interesting is I think that part of the equation is not always discussed. The reality in Ontario is we've had a high cost but also a high aid system, and the recent reforms really double down on that model to a point where net tuition for a large number of students would be free or in fact negative to the extent that they would receive substantial money in addition to their tuition being covered.
Yeah.
So I think it's that net that's the key piece. And I think, when you're thinking about progressive public policy where those who most need the support are receiving the support, but those who can afford to pay are paying, that type of model reflects those principles. And I think also from a system sustainability piece, it's important as well.
Yeah.
Do we want to be subsidizing high-income people who we pretty much know can afford to pay and are going to go in any event?
Yeah.
Or are those dollars better directed elsewhere?
What are your insights or what is your idea as to what another type of reform could look like with regards to tuition, especially considering we had when Liberals implement free tuition for gross income being less than $50,000, and then we had the current Ford government claw that back. It's been extremely controversial, especially amongst the student community. So yeah, what are your insights?
Well, I mean, firstly, maybe I'll take a step back and explain. So the free tuition, the big headline was announced in the 2016 Ontario budget. And so obviously the free piece is what caught everyone's attention. And I guess rightly so. But there were many other aspects to the student aid transformation that I think were, I would say, equally important, potentially more important in some ways. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about what happened there, and then at a high level what's happened since with the new government and what it means. There were a few things that we are trying to do. The first and obvious one was increasing access, in particular for low-income students, where the data pretty clearly showed that students from higher-income families are much more likely to go than students from low-income families. So how do you reduce that access, that access barrier through financial aid? So that was a key piece of it. A second key piece of it was to substantially simplify the system. So over the years, the OSAP system, the student aid system, had accumulated a whole range of programs. No one could really figure out what they all were, how they worked. So it was very complicated and really sort of non-transparent to students and frankly to everybody. So how do you simplify all that? A third one was how do you support those access objectives by assisting students in terms of their user experience with the system. So a big piece of it was how do we bring digital tools to the table in terms of a substantial renewal of the online application and all the online tools, in terms of digital marketing communications around helping students understand how much they could get, how they would benefit, what it meant in terms of what their options were in terms of going to post-secondary. So that piece was really important. And also in terms of the reforms around payment timing. So part of the bizarre aspect of the pre-16 reforms was some of the biggest tranches of money came to students, without getting into all the details, at the end of the school year, where basically their student loans were turned to grants. And so magically in April you'd find out, hey, it turns out I owe $4,000 less than. But this is a pretty non-transparent, backwards way of giving people a $4,000 grant. And then the other big piece was through tax credits that represented a substantial amount. And you couldn't collect those tax credits until 3 or 4 years down the road. And the data showed that a lot of the benefits of those credits were going to higher income families. So simplifying and improving the payment so students get the money when they actually need it. And then the final piece was there was a fiscal component to it. And so the Premier and the Minister, my boss at the time, were really focused on how do we have impact without necessarily spending more money? How can we take what we're currently doing and spending and do better with it? And so the essence of the reform was we would eliminate those tax credits, make all those system reforms, and push the money into this one Ontario student grant that would be simpler, that could push the money to the front end for the students, and that could by and large spend about the same amount of money as it was before. So all of that went reasonably well. In some respects, it went too well. And so part of the issue was the uptake of the new program once launched wound up being higher than expected, which some viewed as a good thing. But from the fiscal perspective, the cost jumped substantially. And so the new government came in 2018, and they found that it was supposed to be a reasonably revenue neutral or cost neutral reform, was looking a lot more expensive. And so they publicly said, well, we had to do something about this. We had to sort of right size this to some extent. And so in large measure what they did was reverse some of the reforms that had shifted a lot of the aid in the form of loans back to grants, and they made a few other tweaks that could bring down the costs. But a lot of those structural aspects of the reform, I think, now being an outsider to government, but I think remain intact, which is positive. And, I would say, having spent a bunch of time working at the Finance Ministry and Treasury, I have some sympathy for the incoming Progressive Conservative government who saw that the costs were far in excess of what the plan had been and felt they had to do something about it.
Yeah. Oh, unsustainable. That's the buzzword that we saw when the Ford government announced that they needed to revamp things. And so along this line of looking at where efficiencies can be made and so on, and looking at what you have to compromise, would you say something like free tuition is unsustainable, whether for lower income families or universally? And what would be an alternative, or how can we make accessible tuition sustainable?
Well, I think what's interesting is a lot of this is mixed up in communications. So the Liberal government announced free tuition, and that whole reform that I outlined was put in place. And so the outcome was it was in fact net free tuition for a reasonably large number of students. The new government comes in and they pared a lot of that back, but sticking to a large extent with a progressive income tested structure, I would say, except for that 10% tuition cut that they put in place. And so the result is the net tuition is still actually free or negative for a lot of students. And if you go right now onto the OSAP website, they have a very simple aid calculator that you can plug in some very basic variables, and it'll spit out some scenarios for you. And so just in throwing in a few numbers, it appears as though the average university or college tuition on the net basis would still be free at about $70,000. So I think the strange part is government absolutely took a lot of money. In some respects, for certain segments of students, it does remain net free for them. And I don't think that part of the story is told.
Shared,
I think the narrative is really they killed free tuition.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And along the lines, again, of this unaffordability or lack of access, what do you think are the causes in terms of whether it's it not being communicated properly, students still thinking that they can't afford tuition, or is it are there actually systemic barriers that are preventing people from accessing post-secondary education?
Well, I mean, I think one of our big revelations when we were working on all this was, and people who've studied this for a while, they wouldn't say this is a surprise, but it was certainly a learning for me and I think for others, was there's this sense that if you can solve the financial barrier for those most in need of support to gain access, everything else will take care of itself. And what we learned was that in many cases it's actually the non-financial barriers that can be much more important. And so, it's a whole range of things, from firstly, even just communicating that the financial assistance is available is major hurdle number one. And so we put major efforts into that, which maybe in an ironic sort of roundabout way is what drove uptake, which then resulted in the paring back of the program. But a huge focus on, how do you talk to those students who are most at risk of not going because they don't know they could gain access through the financial supports. And then, there are a whole range of things that are really sort of deeper challenges. People's parents or their peer groups are big influences on whether or not they go. If you're from, what they call a low transition high school where reasonably few go on to post-secondary, obviously that has a sort of a self-reinforcing effect on whether or not you can get the aid, whether you're inclined to want to go to post-secondary, whether you perceive it to have value and is supporting something for you going forward. So there are a whole bunch of these other factors, and so finance is a very important one, but a lot of those other factors can be very influential for people in making the decision or considering their future sort of possibilities. And a lot of those have to be dealt with well before you're 16 or 17 and making the decision about, do I go or don't I go? And if so, do I pick a university or a college or what?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a great transition into my next question, which is something I wanted to pick your brain about. So for context, and André will know this from taking a macro econ class, we're learning about the production side of GDP and investing in human capital. And one of the great debates surrounding this is, do we invest in early childhood education, or do we invest in post-secondary education and even postgraduate education? And where do we see the most returns on investment, and what's more effective? So just out of curiosity, what's your take on that?
Well, I would preface this by saying it's been probably 10 years since my macro course, so I'm probably a little bit rusty. And I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but from what I've read and from what I know...
Your experience as well, yeah.
My experience as well. I think the research is pretty compelling in terms of the benefits to support for early childhood education and the The full-day kindergarten expansion in Ontario was an example sort of supported through that research. I think the piece that's most compelling to me is, if the objective is to enable equality of opportunity for people as they come up, we know that the cognitive development in those early years is extremely important. We know that students in those early years can very quickly start to fall behind. And so to me, from both, sort of the moral and the cognitive development perspective, that phase is incredibly important. And it's, it has a great potential to be more of a social and economic leveler. I think what's interesting with both is, for whatever reason, our K-12 education system is basically has been deemed to be something that should be universal and publicly paid for. And yet, early childhood education, to the extent that it falls in there, sure. Childcare isn't, which sort of blends with early learning. Post-secondary isn't really either. They're both these kind of hybrid public-private goods, where K-12 is more universal public. So there's kind of a weird sort of alignment between those two. But anyways, my instinct would be those investments in early learning are potentially more impactful, and with the right type of post-secondary funding model where you're providing subsidies, income-tested subsidies to those who need it for post-secondary, you can have a largely privately paid model at that level, because the value to the learner can be a bit more directly tangible immediately after, as they're getting jobs and entering into their careers.
Right. Well, you just answered my last question, which was, what would that look like? But yeah, is there anything else you'd like to share? Any other insights you'd like to provide?
Well, I think the last point I would make, we're very focused on some of these inputs. We should be way more focused on the outputs or the outcomes to our experience in post-secondary. And some of these can be outputs like how many people are completing or how many are dropping out in first year or after, but then how many are graduating. And then, what is the quality of the post-secondary education that we're receiving? I mean, it's frankly not assessed, and I think that should be something that is of far greater concern to students and frankly to everybody. What tangible knowledge and skills are we departing our post-secondary educations with? So I think as much as the cost side is important, it's all those other things that are going to have, and frankly, the experience. I think that's also really important.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really insightful discussion.
Okay, my pleasure.
Once again, that was André Côté. You've been listening to Beyond the Headlines. Many thanks to our guests for joining us to discuss whether post-secondary education is accessible in Canada. Today's show was produced by Anna Miller, Genevieve Tallmeister, and Fatima Ibrahim. The views expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the producers, CIUT, or the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. If you missed any part of the show, be sure to check out podcasts of all of our episodes on our website, www.beyondtotheheadlines.net. If you're a fan of our show or want to stay up to date with policy issues in Canada, follow us on Twitter at @beyond_headlines. You can also check us out on Facebook or Instagram. Be sure to tune in next week as we continue to take public policy discussions out of the hallways and onto the airwaves.